So here's something interesting. On Wednesday, the 20th of March, one of the biggest individual corporate fines in South African history was handed out to a Markus Johannes Jooste. 475 million rand, nearly $500 million. Markus had been trying as hard as he could to keep a very low profile since the 2017 spectacular collapse of the company that he ran, Steinhoff. So the story goes that on the day after the fine was handed out, 63-year-old Markus Jooste waited for his wife to go out to play a round of golf. Very usual. He then made his way to a nearby cliff that was close to his magnificently lavish home in Hermanus. In fact, that same home had walls that had been vandalized multiple times with graffiti that was emblazoned with words like fraudster, con artist, and psychopath. On this day, the 21st of March 2024, this day was the last day that the former CEO of Steinhoff and the mastermind of South Africa's greatest corporate scam met his end by his own hand. He committed suicide. Steinhoff's destruction caused by Markus and his motley crew now stands at an estimated 250 billion rand or $13 billion. That's how much money was lost from their alleged criminality. Now, I, as a decent enough consumer of South African conspiracy theories, I must mention that some people still believe that he never actually died and that he's hiding on some tropical island with Gavin Watson. But I'd rather stick to the facts on this one and not so much on the bright time stories, for now at least, unless someone has evidence that can point us to the contrary. But honestly, what I think makes people feel very suspicious about the circumstances around his death is that it came after the Financial Sector Conduct Authority had issued this ruling. And then a day before that, he had been instructed to hand himself over to the Hawks. So all in all, the pressure was mounting on Markus. Now, why am I making this video piece? Well, I think that for some time now, journal-type people have always spoken, written, and covered Markus Jooste and Steinhoff's corruption as something that was sophisticated and too complex to understand. Almost like how they cover that other genocidal country. I hope you catch my drift. Now, having followed the news and watched a few documentaries, I always found it so bizarre that all of the finance-type people speaking on this never really broke down the how of the Steinhoff collapse. The actuals around how Markus and his co-conspirators actually did some of this. So that's exactly what we're going to do in this piece. I'm going to try to help you understand how Markus, through greed, criminality, and just ubugebenga, brought down the second largest furniture company in the world. The whole world. For those who don't have the time to stick around for this rather long piece compared to my other stuff, let me give you an overview. An Amapungane and Financial Mail investigation circa 2018 confirmed what many people had long suspected since the scandal of Steinhoff came out. Former Steinhoff CEO Markus Jooste was a double-dipping corporate scoundrel, allegedly, of course. He secretly held stakes in companies via friends and associates, companies that traded with Steinhoff for many years to Jooste's covert and skebenga benefit. These deals and their true beneficiaries were always hidden from investors, shareholders, and stakeholders. Also, he wasn't the only person. Some of the people that went on documentaries and said that they never knew anything about what he did were found to be connected in clear contradiction of what they were saying. Now, some of these underhanded Steinhoff deals also secretly included the Steinhoff family themselves. This was through a trust that was started by the company's founder, Bruno Steinhoff, for his daughters, and it included people like the Steinhoff director at the time, Angela Kruger Steinhoff herself. Always so interesting that when I see interviews of either Bruno Steinhoff and even sometimes Christo Visser, they always tried to come off as being people that never really knew what was ever going on. Or maybe at least Christo didn't. But Bruno, nah champ. Two really astute business people and they didn't know a single thing about this. Okay, sharp. Let's continue with the story. Now, based off an Amapungane and Financial Mail investigation, Markus and his people used Steinhoff to secretly enrich themselves. And Bruno Steinhoff's family wasn't too far off. And this was at the expense of shareholders and just normal South Africans. Even your South African pension money was involved here via the PIC. the Public Investment Corporation, who lost up to 21 billion rands or $1.1 billion at the time. This was when Steinhoff collapsed due to the corruption. But in order for us to understand this, we need to go into Markus Jooste's network. Now, at the heart of Markus Jooste's network and this web of deceit, there were two key figures: Malcolm King, a British property developer with a really shady past, and George Allen Evans, a former banker who was residing in Geneva. There's Switzerland again for you. Now, Evans had a reputation for being very discreet and perhaps not always legal in his financial maneuvers. He was a man who made things happen for those who needed them to happen, those with deep pockets like Markus. But I want us to start with Evans. Evans was a former Citibank executive with really deep understanding of offshore financing. He emerged as a key figure in this Steinhoff scandal. Having established himself as a trust company provider in Jersey, he became the architect of a complex web of offshore entities for both Markus Jooste and the Steinhoff family. He stayed with Citibank through the 1970s and the 80s, taking assignments in New York, Kenya, and Turkey before resigning in 1990 to pursue private interests. We'll get to what those private interests were. By 1997, Evans was handling both Jooste's and the Steinhoff family's offshore affairs, pretty much most, if not all of them. He incorporated a company called Danesfort Investments in Jersey, which is a tax haven. This would be Markus Jooste's personal overseas vehicle. Now, this man could really multitask, let me tell you. While he was doing this, he was also managing the Steinhoff family's Marksman Trust. On top of that, Evans assumed control of Jooste's existing trust, Nordic Settlements. Evans would place Danesfort under Nordic 2 as a subsidiary. These entities would be the main vehicles of these secret deals. Effectively, through these actions, Evans had consolidated his influence over Markus Jooste's offshore wealth. He was the bagman. Then let's get to King. Malcolm King was a rather shadowy figure in Jooste's criminal network, but he was still really significant. Residing in affluent Cirencester in England, he amassed wealth through shrewd property investments. His path intersected with Jooste's through a seemingly random but very consequential social connection. See, rich people know other rich people and they introduce each other. In 1993, Jooste, along with a selected group of South African associates, made a strategic move by buying a 25% stake in two of King's key property companies, Marketing and Development Holdings in the UK, and also in another discreetly registered entity in the tax haven of the British Virgin Islands. Now, Marketing and Development boasted a portfolio of properties which included Formal House and Formal Industrial Park, setting the stage for King's burgeoning property empire. This empire, which it would later become very clear to us, thrived on a foundation of very questionable deals, profiting significantly from the illicit activities orchestrated by King, Evans, and Markus Jooste, all done within and around the confines of Steinhoff. But let's get to how these deals actually worked. Now you kind of know the players in the story, but to get a clearer understanding of how they operated inside and outside of Steinhoff, we need to walk the line. We need to go through one and a couple of their business deals and get to see how they work. But we need to start in 1998. So that year, Steinhoff actually needed money to expand. They were a growing company. So naturally, they headed to the JSE. Now, when the company listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange that year, its shares were priced at 4 Rand. They would eventually hit a peak of 93 Rand and 60 cents on the 30th of August 2016. And at that time, the company was valued at its peak at a market capitalization of 372 billion Rand or $26 billion. Now, while the public was cheering on Steinhoff's ascent onto the JSE, a clandestine operation was unfolding behind the scenes. Unbeknownst to investors, Evans, the offshore property guy, was quietly laying the groundwork for a web of hidden wealth to flow from Steinhoff proxy deals to them. Now, as Steinhoff prepared for its public listing, Evans, on behalf of Jooste and the Steinhoff family, established a network of overseas trusts that were designed to siphon off profits from the company's future success and its future deals. Just to be clear, at this point, these guys were getting ready to steal money. They were getting ready to steal from shareholders via the company through future deals. One such deal that was packaged was that of Spearhead Furniture, a UK-based importer of South African pine furniture. Spearhead was surprisingly previously owned by Jooste's associate, Jim Lewis. This company would play a very pivotal role in this particular scheme. Shortly after the listing, a seemingly random event occurred. Evans's firm, Warren Trustees, acquired a shell company in the Bahamas called Alva Glen Estates. This was done through Mossack Fonseca, a notorious facilitator of offshore entities. Check the Panama Papers. From its inception, Alva Glen's founding directors were Evans, as well as one of his employees and two nominee directors. From a May 1999 document, Evans said that Alva Glen wanted to buy certain industrial premises located at Ashchurch, Tewkesbury, Gloucester in the United Kingdom. I mean, to be fair, there was nothing to see here, just a shell company buying industrial space, right? The thing is, for this, Barclays Bank would have to lend Alva Glen £2.65 million, around 26 million rand at the time. So Alva Glen, a faceless entity with no assets or history, was poised to make a significant property acquisition. Okay, sometimes this happens. But how could a company with no creditworthiness secure a multi-million pound loan? The answer lay in a hidden agreement with Steinhoff itself. Alva Glen, it turned out, was a conduit, a secret vehicle to funnel profits back to Markus Jooste. Let's get into how they did it. Steinhoff was standing behind this deal. Alva Glen would enter into a lease agreement with Spearhead to lease the said premises for a period of 25 years. But, crucially, Steinhoff Europe would also guarantee Spearhead's lease. This was a lucky break for this company, I guess. So, Alva Glen would simultaneously sign a lease with Steinhoff, get a loan on the strength of the balance sheet of Steinhoff Europe, and then they'd basically buy the property. In other words, Steinhoff used its balance sheet to bankroll Alva Glen's new property acquisition. It was just all too easy for them. Then the wealth or revenue created from Steinhoff's lease payments and its financial guarantee, those flowed into the companies covertly owned by Steinhoff top brass themselves. It's at this point that we all have to ask how no one in the investment committees at Steinhoff, no one asked why they as a company were helping a shell company with no track record buy into a building through their balance sheet and through their reputation, then come back to them and lease the same building from them. Maybe they convinced the committee that it wasn't their core business to even own warehouses. Maybe this is how they did it. And as maybe you could also let us know in the comments, like how you think they convinced them. Tell us what you think of this transaction. Is it shady? Is it normal? Now, a closer look at another company called Pavilion Properties further exposes this whole thing of how Markus did this. Unbeknownst to the public, Jooste had secretly acquired a stake in Pavilion in 1993, holding this stake through an offshore trust called Nordic. This was alongside a select group of associates. Now, this secretive investment proved to be really shrewd. I mean, the guy was a great businessman, I guess. Pavilion in 1993 had strategically invested in two of King's property companies, those that I spoke of, which included marketing and development. Now, the acquisition of that Tewkesbury site by Alva Glen in 1999 dramatically increased Pavilion's value, reaching an estimated £3.55 million, 37 million rand at the time. This obviously resulted in a significant windfall for Markus Jooste and his gents. Now, besides the rent paid to Alva Glen, Evans also invoiced Steinhoff's Europe director, Sigma Schmidt, every 3 months on an Alva Glen letterhead for £100,000, around 1.4 million rand. This was for a management charge. The Steinhoff family, even though they say they never knew anything of this, soon joined this very clandestine venture. In early 2000, Evans, through a shell company named Jamison Overseas, acquired shares in Pavilion. Shortly after this, the Steinhoff family's Marksman Trust discreetly assumed an ownership into Jamison. Layers on layers on layers. Internal memos actually reveal a carefully orchestrated plan. Alva Glen would develop that Tewkesbury site and then lease it to a UK trading company. This was just a thinly veiled reference to Steinhoff itself. They were stacking the deck. Now, this web of shell companies and trusts was very meticulously designed to conceal anyone's actual involvement, anyone of substance. But what it also did was to ensure that Jooste and the Steinhoffs, as well as King, could profit handsomely from this lucrative arrangement while still maintaining an air of plausible deniability. Hey man, my name's not on any of the documents, so it is what it is. Again, I ask this. Why then was old man Bruno Steinhoff saying that he wasn't aware of anything that was happening, anything that Jooste was actually up to? But I want us to then talk about front running. Another thing that must be clear here is that Jooste, through his offshore company network, was actually buying up Steinhoff company assets at possibly knockdown prices and likely making a profit from selling them on or leasing them out, most times to Steinhoff. But a lot of this just never came up in Steinhoff's financials, thanks to those trusty auditors and accounting irregularities. That's what they called it at the time, because it's not corruption if it's corporate SA. According to Steinhoff's accounts, the proceeds received from the sale of property, plant, and equipment amounted to 340 million, which translated to the exchange rate at the time to just over 30.4 million pounds. Did this mean that Markus Jooste and his chomies actually bought the entire portfolio of Steinhoff Africa? Who knows? But coincidentally, Jooste's trust in July of 2000 had transferred 30.4 million pounds to Pavilion, with the transaction descriptions saying Steinhoff Pavilion Properties. By the mid-2000s, investors and journalists had caught on. Reports started to come out about how shady offshore companies had amassed shares in companies that would later be bought by Steinhoff in the UK and Australia for a premium. The implication was that this was front-running, which in itself is a form of market manipulation where insiders in a company use their knowledge to buy into companies knowing that a deal is imminent and that they can make a quick profit on the up. For example, in 1999, a British Virgin Islands company called Formal Property Management Services bought shares in the London-listed bed and mattress firm Airspring Furniture Group. According to the news reports at the time, Formal, which was actually representing King, had scooped up 2% of Airspring by March of 2003. Later in 2003, Steinhoff would announce that it would buy up Airsprung's major assets, its subsidiary Sprung Slumber. I guess that's just being lucky. That's just being a great businessman. In 2000, Formal Property Management Services bought shares in a British furniture maker as well called Conwell Parker. It's not known if this was a Steinhoff acquisition target or they were looking for a trading partner, but internal formal documents revealed a back-to-back agreement that had been signed between it and Jooste's Danefort Investments. I hope you're keeping up. Now, one of the things that came out is that in the above transaction, Airsprung and Conwell Parker, the company Formal, is acting 50% on its own account and 50% on the account of Danefort Investments Limited, who would have to pay the company 50% of the purchase costs. In other words, King was basically fronting for Jooste in this deal. Yet King's lawyers told everyone, and even Jooste said that he had never had any interest in Formal Property Management Services. But let's go down under to Australia and see what was going on there. Steinhoff's foray into the Australian market began in 1999 with a seemingly strange, nothing to see here partnership with Freedom Group, an Australian-listed furniture retailer. However, beneath the surface, a more sinister game was actually afoot. While Steinhoff and Freedom formed a joint venture called Steinhoff Pacific, Jooste, while serving on Freedom's board, orchestrated a secret share-buying spree. King, acting as Jooste's proxy, utilized Formal's property to accumulate shares, while Evans, through a Bahamian company called Hawkesbury, joined in as well. By mid-2002, these entities had amassed a substantial 27% stake in Freedom, raising eyebrows amongst investors. Why? The Steinhoff family, through their Swiss investment vehicle, Vihag, Fins and Handels, also significantly increased their stake in Freedom, with Jooste himself signing the share transfer agreements and documents on Vihag's behalf, further solidifying his involvement in all of this. As one astute investor observed in the Australian Financial Review, He said, I find it very hard to understand why Formal and Hawkesbury would put so much capital into a small Australian retailer and have no active involvement. This suspicion, as subsequent events would reveal, was entirely justified. This gentleman was onto something. In 2003, Steinhoff played a key role in funding a management buyout of Freedom for 221 million Australian dollars, a move that would handsomely reward those who had anticipated this outcome. King's lawyers, however, vehemently denied any wrongdoing, dismissing accusations of insider trading. Lol, come on now. I hope it's all starting to become a little bit clearer to you guys. How these guys were actually moving. They were moving shifty. Okay, we're done with Australia. Let's go back to the UK. By August of 2004, Formal Property, a company with a history of making highly strategic investments, had amassed a 5.1% stake in Homestyle, a prominent UK furniture retailer. Coincidentally, Steinhoff, a major supplier of furniture to Homestyle, was a key player in this drama that was actually unfolding. Another journalist at the British Independent astutely observed, Formal Property has a history of really spotting companies that are on the cusp of being taken over. But how? Could something similar be on the cards at Homestyle? Investors who were intrigued by this observation began to speculate, driving up Homestyle's stock price. London publisher Citywire aptly dubbed Formal Property the Homestyle stalker. Creepy, right? But like in a corporate way. Totally hidden to many, this stalking may have been part of a larger, more sinister plan. Because in 2005, in a move that surprised the entire market, Steinhoff acquired 61% of Homestyle. This acquisition, seemingly unrelated to Formal's activities, raised eyebrows amongst those who were privy to the inner workings of this really complex web of interconnected interests. Omunye pezgo munye. Now the question is, was this merely a coincidence, or was it actually orchestrated, carefully orchestrated and designed to benefit a select group of individuals? I'll let you tell us in the comments. And while you do that, we need to follow the money. Tracking down what happened to Jooste's offshore interests is rather complicated because it involves a lot of smoke and mirror tactics, which were actually designed to hide who the beneficial owner of these companies was. Take the case of Pavilion Properties. The company was based in Jersey, owned by Markus Jooste and also the Steinhoff family, which had shares in King's property company. While King's lawyers insisted that Jooste does not have any interest in Pavilion Capital, there are three other deals that tie them all together. And I want to run through them really quickly. Because in 2011, Jooste approached retail magnate Christoph Visser on behalf of a mysterious foreign investor to buy his Stellenbosch wine farm, Lanzerek. Now, after the sale, King and Jooste's son-in-law, Stefan Potgieter, actually joined the Lanzerek board. Then in 2012, the SA Coi's property directors King and Potgieter bought a luxurious apartment in Bantry Bay. Later news reports would reveal that a Miss Odendaal, Jooste's alleged romantic partner, actually lived in that apartment and possibly might have owned it, or it was transferred to her. Also, the same Pavilion Capital had put in a claim of 420 million rand against Jooste's SA investment vehicle Mayfair, which was at the time being liquidated. Okay, so what's the crux here? Well, part of a wider problem at Steinhoff during its roaring days of corruption was that they were overvaluing properties at an insane rate, therefore also inflating the company's true value. To put it simply, Steinhoff had sold properties to Jooste's friends and then overpaid to buy those properties back. A lot of insiders agreed that the likely upshot was that the friends got rich and Steinhoff's balance sheet was artificially inflated, or as they put it at the time, irregular. The path from that really small shell company AlphaGlen, from Jooste, King and the Steinhoff family's hands via Pavilion Capital to now Steinhoff EU's property arm Hemisphere almost 14 years later, appeared to clearly show exactly how this scheme worked. Looked at in its entirety, this complicated web of deals shows that properties owned by King and his friends and leased to Steinhoff were packaged into AlphaGlen, then flipped to Steinhoff itself. This was a long-term play. These guys were in it for the long haul, but there was money to grease the wheels in between. But in the end, it all came crashing down in December of 2017. And by 2024, the ringleader decided to take his own life because the cops were closing in. Everything had fallen apart. Depending on where you stand, maybe he never died on that day. Maybe he just disappeared and left someone else holding the bag. But what did die that day are the dreams of investors, public and private. Investors who put in their money and their trust in a finance and regulatory system that promised them that it would ensure that those at the top of corporate companies would stay in line. But alas, it was ipotsoi. It was a potsoi that left so many people with sour tastes in their mouths. Thank you for watching, and shout out to Amapungane and Financial Mail and other reliable sources that helped in investigating this story. Guys that broke this scheme wide open in 2018. This is your recognition. So there you have it. I hope I gave you better understanding around this Steinhoff and Markus Jooste story, a different side of it. I felt that it needed retelling because a lot of people just didn't really dig into it to this level and extent. But the most important thing was that I wanted to show you that corruption in this country is not just a public sector scourge. The corporates are and always have been in on it. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully, it was just as interesting for you to watch as it was for us to make. Maybe check out one of these other videos and hopefully they'll be just as interesting as this one. Cheers.